and so the night progressed. Falkball told them a ghost story about dead spirits walking the land. It was just a variation on most ghost stories, but they enjoyed his retelling, and Elfrith told them the age-old lay of Beowulf. Osrith, on her part, told them of the story of Oswald, king of the Northumbrians, slain in battle by the mighty King Penda, which was well received, as Elfkin fell asleep in his brother's arms. She awoke next morning at dawn and quickly shook Elfgar awake, telling him that she was returning to her guard duty, and to take the men, when called, to Miral. Ethelfled looked as pale and withdrawn as she had looked the night before, but she got to her feet and had her maids make her ready. When she was dressed, she made to eat a little of the meat brought to her. Good, Osrith thought, she has the will to fight, to stand up for herself. And, she realized, the signs were unmistakable to Osrith as she stood guard, the rounding of the woman's stomach, her lethargy and sickness. But, when her maids had gone, she confided in Osrith that the Lord Ethelred has commanded that she see a priest the night before. As the lady told Osrith of the Bitterwaters ordeal, and how Uhtred had intervened on her behalf, and smashed Old Helm in the face, Osrith was outraged. Yes, the woman was a spoiled girl underneath it all, but to put her through that? Yet, thought a voice in the back of Osrith's head, if she had nothing to be concerned about, this judgment ritual would have come to naught. For the most part, Osrith felt sorry for her, to be struck and raped by her husband. But this did not take away the cruelty she had inflicted on Edward, stealing his toys, pinching and scratching him when she thought no one was looking, at an age when she knew exactly what she was doing. When she heard the mercenary army ready on the fields behind them, armor clinking into position, commanders' voices organizing their positions, Osrith spoke to Ethelfled. "Lady," she said, and withdrew Bué, something which Osrith thought she would never have done, and she watched as Ethelfled grip her sword with familiarity, and hold her firmly. She showed her a few moves and she surprised her, although, Osrith thought later, she shouldn't have been surprised, for she had fought with Steepa's help. After a couple of days of guarding the lady, and several hours of tuition, Osrith was walking back to her men again, after being dismissed by Ethelred. Ethelfled looked brighter, Osrith thought, and maybe she would begin to stand up for herself. She made her way across the field to her army, but a hand was on her shoulder. Tagged seeks in hand, Osrith had the blade at the throat of the man who had accosted her and looked into the face of her commander. Plans had changed, Miral explained to her, a little sheepishly, as they strode towards Oldhelm, who had indeed suffered at someone's hand, and if Ethelfled was right, it was her brother's. To listen to the official version, you are to lead your division on the raid on Lundin. 88,888,888. It was much later, far in the future, as Osrith was preparing to leave Mercia, that Elfgar told her that it had been her warriors who had insisted she led them into Lundin. Leofstan had petitioned Miral, he said, and all 5 of them had stood before him, insisting. But that night, Osrith did not know this, although she was still elated. It was what she had wanted, what she had trained for, but she was also mystified. She had been called to guard Ethelfled and only a week later, called back to her men. Other men were to guard her, and the women, at the camp. And so, on a cool, spring morning, the mercenary army strode out to their ancient city. As they walked, surrounded by other mercenary divisions from all over the kingdom, Osrith was pleased to see that the Wessex army was far away, heading to the southern side of the city at Bedford, crossing the ancient bridge and taking the road that would take them to the centre, where the Danes were. Ethelred, on the other hand, was sending half of his men up the river with Oldhelm, and taking the other half himself to the northern side. Osrith and her men were going on foot, and as they marched, she agreed with him the tactics they would be using, to stick together, to skirmish, to secure streets bit by bit, and ensure that no Danes hid who could spring a counter-attack behind them. And no rape, she told the men, clearly, as they stopped for rest within sight of the city walls. I say this not as a woman, but as a warrior. Should you want to hump, wait until we have won, and get a whore and pay her, honestly. I need you together for our strategy to work." Osrith then asked the men to show her what they had practiced, and was mainly interested in how they carried it. Their moves. Their skills had improved, and it was clear Elfrith and Elfka had been successful in their training them, for the men could carry out her commands by rote. But then, plans changed, and the whole of the mercenary army were told to sail, with Ethliard taking the lead, Aldhelm beside him. They were to sail against the tidal current of the Thames, Miriel told Osrith eventually, as the night before, as the army camped within sight of Lundine's walls. Distracted by a pain in her abdomen that Osrith was not used to, for she had recently used the last of the roots sold to her by Allah, she idly wondered as she sat on duty, if Britons inhabited the city, and whether, with a sober quantity of silver about her person, she would be able to find them and offer their healer several in exchange for lily root, at least. But that was all it was, a thought, for the morning light came all too quickly and the men were ushered from camp to begin their attack. Lord Ethliard had taken a northerly path to the city, and Lord Aldhelm had ordered different sections of the army in different direction when they had passed through Ludgate, in order to herd the Northmen into the very centre of Lundine. Egelwulf, one of her younger men, had stopped in appalled wonder as they had approached the city at the barbarity of the Northmen. They had crept through the streets and defeated many, clearing paths of the enemy so they would not counter with a rear attack, working their way up until the moment they had got to the main Roman buildings at the very centre. Siegfried and Eric Thurgilson had made it their own. Osrith's heart beat as she stayed her half-dozen men. All of the mercenaries stayed, when they looked beyond. For, in the very heart of Lundine, on a cross, a man had been nailed, in a very bald, openly mocking caricature of Christ on his cross. He was dead. Osrith could see that, though no one was going to try to get him down. And then she saw Eric, her once temporary ally, standing next to his brother, a blade strapped to his sword hand. She had turned from him at the battle before Dunnottar, and had heard the battle roar as she had fled Alba, when the brothers had tried again to defeat Domhnall. Once she had heard that they were in Lundine, trying their luck with Kent, East Anglia and the bits of Mercia and Wessex around the old Roman city. She found she was glad and relieved that her king, for she still automatically thought of Domhnall as that, had been victorious, though she had gleaned it from stealing glances from the Wessex documents. To see them here, before her, at a gruesome truce, gave her a trickle of joy into her stomach. Osrith's joy soured a little when she caught sight brother. He stood there, tall and broad, glorious in gleaming Frankish mail with the pagan hammers of his defeated enemies, and a cloak, shoulder to ankle, black with a silver lightning bolt on its back. Osrith felt angry at the way he had chosen to treat her. And not just her, he treated many people shabbily, even Lord Ethliard, so she had heard from, who else? Elfrith, and had indeed caused the damage to Aldhelm's face. But worse than that, he treated women as objects. Was it not the same in Alba? Except women were closer to women in authority, as in Mercia. Lands uninfluenced by Francia was where the sexes were levelled. Alba, Wallis, Pitland, Gaelish lands, Strathclyde. The Druistratum levelled it further. For the denigration of women to possessions came only from the Roman Church. Hold! Her brother shouted, and automatically, Mercia's men stopped, too. The square was still as the standoff held and all were waiting for Uhtred, not the Lord Ethliard, and Osrith watched as he took the lead and spoke to Siegfried and Eric, trying not to look at the man beside him. And then it was done. A negotiation for the release of a prisoner by trial of combat. The man declared himself to be a Briton, and Osrith immediately paid more attention. He asked for a sword, and one of the Norse, who had been caressing a woman on one of the steps in the centre of the city, stepped forward. But Father Pyleig, for that was who he was, Osrith found out later, knew exactly how to challenge that young, arrogant man, and within 10 minutes had him on his knees, demanding his freedom, as agreed. When he got up, he strode across to stand beside the Wessex faction, and was greeted with a clap on the back by both Osrith's brother and, more astonishingly, by Father Bukka. Astonishing, because Osrith thought that Bukka would have remained behind with his wife at the camp, and, How good were the men left behind? They were soon to find out, for a cry went up, for an alarm of banging metal, and a fire's smoke rose up. The camp had been raided. Most of the guards had been slain, and the Lady Ethelfled had been taken. 88,888,888. I understand, Aldhelm asked, when Miral brought Osrith to see the commander of the army, that you can speak Norse. The aftermath of the raid had seen the army secure camp, bury the dead, and carry the corpses of the Danish and Northman raiders across to the neighboring field and begin to light a big pyre. And, all the while, Lord Ethelred moped and griped about the loss of his wife. Indeed, Osrith replied. Her first thought was one of doubt. Surely no one thought her capable of any conspiracy against the Wessexes and Mersons. Had she not sworn? But it was not that. And your sword skill is exemplary. I saw you better at least a dozen Norse and Danish raiders today. Osrith said nothing, but nodded. She had. And so had many other men. Falkbald had ended the lives of at least twice that many and had secured the Thurgilson brothers' surrender of Lundin. Osrith had planned to reward them with her own silver before the raid had soured their victory. Thank you. But Aldhelm looked severe, and serious. He was worried, and he had every right to, considering what was at stake. It was your duty to guard the lad Ethelfled, he reminded her, his long nose pointing down towards Osrith. It was, she agreed, and then you told me that the Lord Ethelred had commanded I bring my men. Indeed, Aldhelm cut in. And so you must now return to guarding the lady, Aldhelm said, patiently. He pointed to a pile of clothing that had once belonged to the now ashed enemy who had been killed by some of the Merson and Wessex guards at the camp, at least. Osrith looked at the furs and leather, swords and axes. A good hoard. If you were to have to guard the Lady Ethelfled, even now, how would you go about it? Osrith looked at the battle spoils again, and then knelt, to pick up something. It was a Thor's hammer. I would dress as a Dane. I would follow them, to wherever you would tell me they were going with her. Beamflout, Aldhelm supplied. And at Beamflout, I would ensure her safety, with my life. It was the correct answer. Aldhelm was already nodding her head. Then our ideas are the same. I propose that you attend Lord Ethelred as one of his men at Beamflout, for we have already secured a meeting with the Thurgilson brothers, and then remain behind when we leave. Osrith thought about that, and then nodded. I agree, she said, a coldness stealing over her. She had no choice. Ethelfled captured might mean she was in danger. Yet, she would be ransomed, and worth more, unspoiled. She began, but Aldhelm held up a hand. Your warrior, Alfkin, is also missing. He was not with the women in the forest. We do not know if he is dead. But one of the wives did say that some of the younger men had been taken away by retreating pagans, as slaves. No doubt, Miral put in. Both men were looking at Osrith, who was solent, her mind racing. All that they proposed should indeed work when they left. She could disguise herself easily if she made sure she accessorized herself appropriately. Many of Eric's men were as astute as Wessexes and Mersons. Any tiny deviation, and she would be discovered. She could locate Ethelfled, and keep her safe. Get her out, if she could. She could report, if he could, anything of value. If this is too big a challenge, Aldhelm continued, mistaking her silent thoughts as doubts, then by all means, you must say. But Osrith shook her head. My lord, I can do this, and I will do this. I will do my utmost to keep the Lady of the Mersons safe. 88,888,888. And now, after an arduous march quickly east to the coastal fortification, Osrith was standing in the hall, Mersons on one side, West Saxons on the other. Around an oblong table sat Uhtred, who else, representing Wessex, with Father Buku and Steeper beside him, and on the other, Aldhelm, for Mercia. And where was her lord? He had been put quickly on his back by one of Eric's men, having said a few brief words to Ethelfled. It was the first time Osrith had seen her since Ethelred had ordered her to take back command of her division, and she looked as ill as she had done when she had been under Osrith's protection, but no more harmed. Indeed, there was a color to her cheeks, and she had looked at her husband in the eye when he had spoken to her, rather than away. So, Osrith stood in the hall, clad in Norse leathers, a worn belt and short and long scabbards that were not hers. She had refused old Helm's advice that she should give up tags, seeks and buay, but these were not an issue. Many warriors carried all manner of ironware, so these would not draw the attention of anyone, particularly. Around her neck, but tucked close to her chest, hung a Thor's hammer. When she had put it on, Osrith thought, it wasn't that much different in shape to a Christian cross, the horizontal section being somewhat longer, and the top section a little shorter. Over these clothes, she pressed her own, and was still an English warrior at the side of her Mercen lord, and now she was listening to the pissing contest that was the agreement of the wealth that would be traded in exchange for Ethelflaed's life. She looked across to her brother every so often. He was relishing the debate, Osrith could tell, just to have the opportunity to speak, to brag, to show off. It was when the negotiators made to leave that Osrith made her move, trying to ignite Finan as much as she could, which had been hard when she had been standing not far from the man, and heard him speak and listened to his dry sarcasm. She wondered about Ethelflaed. Could she free her, Osrith thought, as she slipped into the kitchens. Slaves prepared food for the Norse and Danes, and by the time she had got to the larders already her own clothing was off and hidden beneath boards which led to the cellars. She loosened her hair, so it flowed down her back as one long braid, making she fixed her pearl jewel into her hair at the top. And then Osrith discovered Ethelflaed's location. A maid was preparing food on a tray, and she heard her say to another that the lady was to have more bread, more meat. The other maid, avoiding two Danish guards' advances, took the tray out with her. Osrith followed her, and fell into step beside a second guard, who had clearly been ordered to accompany the maid. He nudged Osrith as if he knew her, and kept pointing out the maid's ass and tits, the maid growing ever embarrassed at being stared at until she thrust the tray into Osrith's arms and hurried back to the kitchens. This way, the second guard pointed, or have you forgotten the way? He leaned conspiratorially towards Osrith, and added, I did myself outside this morning, thinking of her face. That is not all you were thinking of, I imagine, Osrith attempted, and the words must have worked, for the guard nudged her arm, nearly causing her to spill the contents of the tray. Are you going to linger, when you take in the tray? He added, as he nodded towards the gated room, which might once have been a stable but was now guarded by 4 of Eric's men. Osrith recognized them from her time with the Norse in Alba, but said nothing to them as the guard filled the void. Is the clothed then, the princess? The guard, whose name turned out to be Rorik, asked the others. Unfortunately for us, nodded one, slapping down a playing tile onto a square board, and adding a copper coin to the top of it. Osrith recognized it to be a gambling game they had played something similar at July, the men betting ever more extravagant sums on the roll of a cube with runes upon it, which caused the pieces to move in certain directions around the board. One of them scraped a chair back, and spat onto the earth. With a grunt, he reached for a ring of keys and found the one he needed, turning the key. Inside, Osrith heard a sharp intake of breath as the metal lock clicked, and she looked upon a face, alert and cautious, arms folded around herself. Perhaps Ethelflaed was used to her meal at this time. Perhaps she would have looked more frightened if her prison, for that was what this place, though well kept and furnished ostensibly was, had been opened at an unexpected time. Put it on the table, she ordered. Osrith fixed her with a stare and, for a brief moment, their eyes met, before Osrith strode to the small table beside the bed and placed it down. And take the other, Ethelflaed added, imperiously. For a prisoner, she was not acting like one. Behind her, the man who had opened the door was getting edgy. Osrith could sense he wanted to rush in and claim her, and yet, he knew what wrath would be upon him from the brothers, if he did that. But he did not like her tone. The princess was a prisoner, the man knew, and should not be speaking like that. Osrith did what the lady had told her to, and removed herself from the room, making up the passage towards the kitchens with Rorik tagging along behind her. That bitch! He exclaimed, spitting onto the ground. She deserves a good humping, and you know, His voice dropped conspiratorially, "I do believe she is getting one." When Osrith protested ignorance, which, in her case, was entirely true, Rorik confided that she had been seen in the company of Eirik Thorgilson on more than one occasion. "You are not one of the brothers' men, are you?" he asked, when Osrith had put the tray back onto one of the kitchen tables, and had been chastised by the cook, though a slave himself, for not putting it where one of the maids could wash it. She wasn't, Osrith admitted, and had come down to the brothers on the word of one of her cousins, who had died. "And from where do you come?" Rorik asked. "Aalborg," Osrith said, having absolutely no clue where the place was. She had heard it was a city in the northern part of Denmark, and agreed with Rorik when he asked her whether her family had been boat builders. "It explains your accent," Rorik said, happily, and went back to guarding the kitchens, Osrith with him, and owned the role, as if this was something she had been asked to do by either Siegfried or Eirik had commanded, on the day they had slaughtered King Ethelstan of East Anglia's men of Beamflout. So this guard, who had seen her randomly one day, had taken up to chatting with her, assuming Osrith was just another warrior, drawn to stronger leaders through want of food and wealth. And the Thorgilsons definitely promised wealth. Even now, Osrith wondered whether the message had got to Alfred. The two kingdoms could never pay the money the brothers asked, and they knew it. A day turned into a week, which turned into 3. Osrith had spent nearly every minute on the mission to keep eyes on Ethelfled and glean as much information as she could, though what exactly she would do with it, Osrith could not tell, for there was no one able to send word to anyone outside of Beamflout. And, she discovered, a man whom she had met, who had boarded and raided Gert and Ulf's fishing boat, was also part of the brothers' band, and Rorik's chief. Had she met the young man before that day? Had he been there when Heston had tried to make a bargain for her with Gert, before stealing the silver she had given to the Frisian man for her passage? One thing was for sure, her position in Beamflout was getting trickier. 88,888,888. On the second day of the 4th week, as Osrith took the tray away from a sleepy Ethelfled, 2 things happened. The second was that she saw Eirik Thorgilson sneak the key and its ring back into the hand of the guard, who was now blotto, face down on the table. Clearly a wine adulterated with some sort of spirit or medicine had caused the men to sleep, and she watched, unseen by the woodpile, as he woke the men up, pressing coins and gaming pieces into their hands. That's when Osrith knew the Norseman had been with Ethelfled, and when Osrith returned with the ladies' food that evening, she really saw the woman, no longer a shy, subdued person, but full of life, full of hope, which was strange, as word had not yet come to Beamflout as to whether Alfred agreed to the ransom. The second thing, to Osrith's horror, was that, inching down her leg was, suddenly, her monthly blood. Perhaps if she had ingratiated herself with Eirik, admitted she was his enemy, but had asked him where he had got the medicine which had put them to sleep, Osrith might not be in the situation. And it was Rorik who had expressed concern as drops of blood spilled onto the flagstone floor. "I fell," Osrith lied, "and cut my leg on sharp rock." When Rorik offered to bandage her injury, Osrith declined, politely, and when he was fast asleep that night she went to a place she knew was concealed, at the far end of the estuary where the Flout River met the sea and strong current pushed the water out to sea. There, she stripped to her cloth bindings concealed between 2 boulders, relishing the cold water, which was refreshing on her skin after a sticky, humid day. Could she free the lady? Osrith washed between her legs before finding leaves with which to pack herself and curling them up to fit. It was a tricky thought, complicated still by the fact she had no ally on her side as representing Mercia with whom she could plan an escape for the princess. Besides, Ethelfled looked so well, would she come willingly? A grain of emotion, not anger, not jealousy, more outrage and bitterness, entered her chest as Osrith thought of the likelihood that Ethelfled had formed an attachment to Eirik. How dare she risk 2 kingdoms for her heart? There was Osrith, who had resisted men, regardless of her feelings once she had come to Wessex, and then gone to Mercia, for her own sake, and the sake of entanglements and difficulties, and all the while the Lady Ethelfled entertained possible ideas of an attachment to Eric, and he her. Though, she could be wrong, Osric told herself. But her first instinct seemed the most plausible, and that instinct had never seen her false. Osric looked at the lapping of the water between the two high rocks, and thought instead about a thing that had brought her joy, tending to the horses. Osric had seen the figure of a young Saxon boy. She had found Elfkin, who had seemed not displeased in his role, and did not seem to be harmed or underfed. Could she free him, too? Osric made to comb through her hair with a bone comb which had been with the spoils from the Danish and Norse battle dead, when hands suddenly gripped her, around her body, around her mouth, and she was dragged underwater. Osric fought with all her might, her naked body remembering the fear of the Foyle River where it met the sea, where she had nearly been murdered by the incoming tide. No, nearly murdered by the two allied princes. But, as suddenly as it had happened, the hands let her go, and she splashed to the surface. I recognized my jewel, Krejikvind, said Erik Thurgilson, amusement playing on his lips. Erik. No matter that he was not on her side in this war, nevertheless, Osric found that she was overjoyed to see him. You're wet, he complained, when Osric stepped back, and then a frown overcame him. You should not have bathed here at night. You could have been followed. I was. Wasn't I? And your clothes may have been stolen. Osric quickly looked around. Nothing she had taken off was where she had left it, beside a rock which flattened out like a seat and fell away into the river. If you have my clothes, give them to me, Osric demanded. Amusement played at the corner of the Northman's mouth again, and he paused, as if giving her suggestion a great deal of serious thought. Then, he handed her a bundle, wrapped delicately with the cord of her cloak. Osric shook the clothes apart. But, still something was missing. You still put on your bindings? It was not a question, and Erik Thurgilson then handed Osric the linen strip she used to flatten her chest. As you showed me, Osric replied, now glancing out to the eastern sea for somewhere to look while she dressed, but when she turned to him, Erik was staring at her naked body. I do remember your body, he mused. I tell you, you have a fine body, though your tits are much smaller than I remember. He was provoking her, Osric knew, and it occurred to her that, when he had known her in Alba, she had been pregnant with Constantine's child. I do not care about my body, she added. I wish that you had not followed me. You are Krejikvind, Erik replied, as if the term should mean to Osric more than it did. It should matter not to you that I look, for you should know I would never do anything about it. It does not matter, Osric lied, and turned her back, trying to make a start on her bindings around her chest. Despite what has been done to it in the name of war, Erik murmured, and shook his head, turning away. Couldn't you have had a quiet life, as a lady? Could you? Osric shot back. Why did every man she knew think marriage was the only thing that occupied the thoughts of women? As a lady? Erik chuckled. I do not think a shift would fit me. And then it was Osric's turn to laugh and, now clad only in a partially wrapped linen cloth, pulled her cloak around herself, then threw her arms around him. It was good to see him, despite everything. This, Osric said, as she gestured back to Beamflout Fortress, the hostage, the ransom. It's your doing, isn't it? Erik nodded, unable to hide the pride that he felt. Osric stepped back, and began to pull on the rest of her looted clothes, and noticed the astonishment on Eric's face that she slipped a Thor's hammer on a chain around her neck. You have ambition, very good, and Ethelfled. The princess is safe, Erik assured her. But Osric found herself frowning. You have imprisoned her, she accused. Erik paused, and stopped himself saying something he was about to. Then, he said, his voice softer, his tone regretful, I would never treat her as you were treated. And Osric could tell then something that something she suspected from the dawn when he had left Ethelfled, and she asked him. You followed me? He asked, accusingly. Fair is fair, Osric replied. You would like to be with the princess. It wasn't a question, and Erik knew it. Would like, have liked. Is she your first? Osric couldn't resist the goad. I have lain beside many women, Erik replied, non-committally, folding his arms. "I lay beside you many times myself," she reminded him. "But you are Krejcikvind. Besides, I needed you to show me your king's fortress. If you were not, I would have asked you if you wanted me, if that is your meaning." A little sparkle of emotion passed between them. "And I would have been glad you asked," Osrith replied, though knew it was a lie. Then, at that time, she had been ill-used by Griogair, and no matter how pleasurable Lyric might have been, Osrith had not wanted him then, nor could ever entertain the idea in her mind. Then, though, Osrith's mind had been filled with her realization that she loved Dagd. She knew, also, the only reason she was talking like this to him now was because he feelings for Ethelfled, and she disliked the woman, her arrogance, her self-entitlement. "Except then you needed a friend." "I am glad you are my friend," Osrith admitted. "I loved my husband, and now, you have lost your heart to the lady." And the truth was bald on his face. And Osrith was pleased, so pleased for him, despite his resentful feelings towards Ethelfled for her stupidity. Just then, Eirik Thorgilsson looked like Uthed had looked on the day of Ethelfled's wedding, standing with Gisela, his heart and hers, together.